You're listening to Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if you found this story tonight, then you've already crossed a threshold most people never reach. I want to ask you something before we begin. Which country are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? Because no matter where you are, no matter what hour you've chosen to press play, you're about to spend the next hour and a half with me, moving through something that isn't mystery for mystery's sake. This is about real documents, real decisions, real systems that were built to make certain things visible and other things structurally absent. If you haven't subscribed yet, I genuinely appreciate it if you would. It helps me keep bringing you these stories every single day. And if this is exactly the kind of thing you've been looking for, stay with me. Because once you understand what I'm about to show you, you won't be able to look at architectural plans, archival indexes, or institutional memory the same way again. You're standing in a specific room in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive until its renaming in 2019, and you're holding a blueprint dated to 1879, created during the papacy of Leo XIII, and this blueprint shows something that appears nowhere else in the entire archival system, a storage chamber labeled only with the designation Riservato Fortatum C, which translates roughly to reserved 14C. And the strange thing, the thing that makes archivists pause when they encounter this document, is that every other chamber in the Vatican archive system from that period appears in multiple blueprints, multiple reform documents, multiple access logs, but this one appears exactly once. The blueprint itself is cataloged under the Fondo Particolare collection, a subsection of materials related to the administrative reorganization of the archives during Leo XIII's unprecedented decision to open portions of the Vatican archives to qualified scholars in 1881, a decision that marked the first time in the Church's history that non-church researchers could access certain categories of documents, though the categories themselves were defined by a complex system of classificatory restrictions that would evolve over the next century and a half. When you look at this blueprint, you notice immediately that it's drawn in the standard architectural notation of the period, using measurements in Roman palmi, an old measurement system that equals approximately 22.3 centimeters per unit. And the chamber in question is marked as being 47 palmi in length and 31 palmi in width, which translates to roughly 10.5 meters by 7 meters, a room of moderate size, certainly large enough to house significant document collections but not so large as to be one of the major storage halls. The blueprint shows the chamber positioned in what appears to be the second subterranean level, beneath the Cortile della Pina, the courtyard of the pine cone, which is itself a recognizable landmark within Vatican architecture, created during the Renaissance and named for the massive bronze pine cone sculpture that had been moved there from the old St. Peter's Basilica. And if you know the Vatican's physical geography, you know that the Cortile della Pina sits between the Vatican museums and the administrative buildings, an area that underwent substantial renovation during the late 19th century, precisely because Leo XIII wanted to create proper archival storage that met emerging standards for document preservation while simultaneously maintaining the institutional structures of restriction that the Church considered essential to its operation. The reason this matters, the reason you're looking at this specific blueprint right now, is that when scholars began systematically comparing archival documents in the 1960s and 1970s, following the Second Vatican Council's broader push toward transparency and the gradual opening of more archival materials, several researchers noticed that the physical architecture of the Vatican archive spaces didn't always match the official descriptions in access catalogs. And this discrepancy wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a matter of entire buildings appearing or disappearing, but rather a matter of specific rooms, specific storage designations that seem to exist in one document type but not in others. Riservato 14C is the most documented example of this phenomenon. because it appears so clearly in that 1879 blueprint, complete with architectural measurements and positioning relative to other rooms. But when researchers tried to cross-reference this chamber with the Vatican's own internal catalog system, known as the Scenario Garampi, after the 18th century prefect Giuseppe Garampi, who helped systematize early archival organization, there was no corresponding entry, no collection designated as being housed in that space, no access restriction notation that would indicate the room was simply sealed or classified. The Scenario Garampi, which remains one of the foundational organizational tools in the Vatican archives, uses a system where each major document collection receives a specific shelf designation, a catalog code, and a location marker that indicates which room or quarter houses the material. And this system was refined substantially during the 1880s precisely because Leo XIII's opening of the archives required a more sophisticated tracking mechanism than had previously existed. Yet Riservato 14C appears in none of these location markers, despite being clearly marked on a blueprint created during exactly the period when such systems were being formalized. The institutional mechanism at work here is something historians call architectural preservation without indexical preservation, which is an awkward phrase but describes a specific practice where physical spaces are documented in construction and renovation records but are not included in the systems that govern researcher access or archival navigation, and this practice was not unique to the Vatican. It appeared in various forms in national archives across Europe during the 19th century as archival science was becoming a formal discipline, and institutions were grappling with how to balance preservation, access, and institutional control. In the Vatican's case, the practice emerged from a tension between Leo XIII's genuine commitment to opening historical materials for scholarly research and the Church's equally genuine concern about maintaining control over documents that touched on sensitive matters of church governance, diplomatic correspondence, and internal disciplinary proceedings. The solution, implemented through various administrative reforms between 1879 and 1884, was to create a multi-tiered system where certain collections were available by request, meaning they appeared in catalogs and could be accessed through formal application processes, while other collections were preserved but not indexed, meaning they existed physically but were not included in the navigational tools that researchers use to locate materials. Riservato 14C appears to have been designated in this second category, a space that was architecturally integrated into the archive structure but was excluded from the indexing systems that would make it discoverable. The verifiable historical anchor for understanding the system comes from a specific document preserved in the Vatican's own administrative records, a circular letter dated November 1881, written by Cardinal Giuseppe Hergenruther, who served as the first prefect of the Vatican archives under Leo XIII. New organizational structure, and in this letter, which was distributed to the small number of senior archivists working in the Vatican at the time, Hergenruther outlines the principles that should govern which materials are made catalog visible and which should remain architecturally present but navigationally absent. And while the letter uses carefully diplomatic language, the core principle is clear. Materials that could be used to challenge church, teaching that documented internal conflicts among church officials or that contained correspondence with political entities regarding matters that remain diplomatically sensitive should be preserved for internal church use but should not be made accessible through the standard catalog systems. Hergenruther was not inventing this principle out of thin air. He was formalizing a practice that had existed informally for centuries, but his formalization is significant because it created an official institutional mechanism, one that would shape how the Vatican archives operated for the next several decades, and, some historians quietly argue, continues to shape certain aspects of archival access even today. The real consequence of this system, the thing that affects how we understand Vatican archives and institutional memory more broadly, is that it created a category of materials that exist in a kind of documentary limbo. They are not hidden in the sense of being actively concealed, but they are also not accessible in the sense of being findable through normal research methods. And this creates a specific type of historical silence, one that is structural rather than conspiratorial. When a researcher sits in the Vatican archive reading room today, they work from catalogs, indexes, and finding aids that represent decades of archival science and organization. And these tools are genuinely sophisticated, genuinely useful, and genuinely designed to help researchers locate relevant materials. But they are also, by design, incomplete representations of what physically exists in the archive spaces, and the incompleteness is not accidental, but is rather the product of institutional decisions made during specific reform periods, particularly the Leo XIII reforms of the 1880s, about what should be navigation visible and what should remain navigation absent even while being preservation present. Riservato fortam vorsi. The chamber that appears only in one blueprint is the most concrete example we have of this system in action. A space that was built, that was documented in construction records, that presumably housed materials at some point, but that was never integrated into the navigational systems that would allow researchers to say, I would like to access the materials stored in Riservato 14 because officially, navigationally, that chamber does not exist in the systems that govern access requests. Now you're moving deeper into the administrative logic that made such a system possible. And to understand why Riservato Bitno C matters, you need to understand something specific about how the Vatican's archival classification system worked during the period between Leo XIII's reforms in 1881 and the next major reorganization under Pope Pius XI in 1924. And the key mechanism here is something called the fondo system, which is the Italian term for an archival collection organized by institutional origin rather than by subject matter. And this system, which became standard practice in Italian archival science during the late 19th century, meant that documents were grouped according to which church office or administrative body had created them rather than being reorganized by historians into thematic categories. The fondo system had obvious advantages for institutional memory. It kept administrative records together, it preserved the original context in which documents were created, and it made it easier for church officials to locate materials related to ongoing administrative matters. But it also had a specific consequence for researcher access because it meant that finding materials on a particular topic required knowing which church offices had dealt with that topic during which time periods. And since the church's administrative structure had changed repeatedly over centuries, this requirement created a significant barrier to access, even for materials that were theoretically open to researchers. The Vatican archive contains hundreds of fondi, some massive and well-documented like the Fondo Segreteria di Stato, which holds correspondence from the Papal Secretary of State's office, and others small and obscure like the Fondo Computisteria, which holds financial accounting records from various church institutions. And each fondo was supposed to have a corresponding entry in the Scenario Garampi that indicated where the materials were physically stored. But here's where Riservato 14 first C becomes relevant again. The 1879 blueprint shows this chamber in a location that, based on its position relative to other documented rooms, should have housed materials from either the Fondo Particolare or possibly from one of the smaller administrative fondi related to church property management, but no catalog entry from that period identifies any collection as being stored in that specific location. The person who noticed this discrepancy most systematically was a German Jesuit, historian named Hubert Jedden, who worked extensively in the Vatican archives during the 1950s and 1960s while researching his multi-volume history of the Council of Trent. And Jedden had the kind of obsessive attention to archival organization that made him notice small inconsistencies And in a footnote in the third volume of his work, published in 1970, he mentions that during his research he encountered several instances where blueprint records from the Leo XIII period showed storage spaces that did not correspond to any catalog entries, and he notes specifically that one such space, which he identifies by its designation Riservato 14th PC, appeared to have been designed to house materials from the Tribunale della Sacra Romana Rota, which was one of the three main ecclesiastical courts that handled church legal proceedings, including marriage annulments, benefice disputes, and certain categories of disciplinary cases involving clergy. Jedden's observation matters because the Rota's records from certain periods are among the most restricted categories in the Vatican archives, not because they contain theological scandals, but because they contain detailed legal proceedings involving real people, real families, and real property disputes, many of which touched on politically sensitive matters in European states where the Church's legal jurisdiction intersected with civil authority, and the Church has consistently maintained that releasing certain categories of these records would violate privacy expectations and potentially expose individuals and families to unwanted attention even centuries after the events in question. The institutional mechanism that governed Rota records during the Leo XIII period was established through a specific decree issued in October 1882 by the prefect Jürgen Rother. And this decree, which is preserved in the administrative records of the archive itself under Catalog Code Arch.vat AA Arm 568 6571, established that while certain categories of Rota cases could be made available to researchers who could demonstrate a legitimate scholarly need and who agreed to specific publication restrictions, other categories would remain preservation archived, but access restricted, which meant they would be stored in archive spaces but would not be included in public-facing catalogs and could only be accessed through special permission granted by the Cardinal Prefect himself on a case-by-case basis. The decree doesn't specifically mention Riservato Forcidirosi, but it does reference the need for appropriate physical separation of restricted materials. And when you compare the timing of this decree with the date on the blueprint showing Riservato Forcidirosi, the inference that this chamber was intended to house such materials becomes difficult to avoid, though it remains technically an inference because no document explicitly states Riservato Forcidirosi contains Rota records from Category X. The verifiable historical anchor that gives us more concrete understanding comes from a later document, a memorandum written in 1931 during the reorganization of the archives under Pius XIII, when the Vatican was attempting to create more systematic access procedures in response to growing pressure from historical scholars who argued that the Church's archival restrictions were hindering legitimate research into Church history. And this memorandum, written by Monsignor Angelo Mercati, who served as prefect of the archives from 1925 to 1936, discusses the challenge of integrating materials that had been stored in legacy reservation spaces into the newer organizational systems being implemented in the 1930s. And Mercati specifically notes that several storage chambers from the Leo XIII period contained materials that had never been formally cataloged, and that decisions would need to be made about whether to catalog them retroactively or to maintain their existing status as preserved but uncatalogued collections. The memorandum lists several of these chambers by designation, and Riservato 14C appears in this list, with a notation that indicates the chamber's contents related to legal proceedings of mixed jurisdiction, which is archival terminology for cases that involve both church law and civil law. Exactly the kind of material that would have come from Rota proceedings involving property, marriage, or benefice disputes in European territories where church and state authority overlapped. The real consequence here, the thing that matters for understanding how institutional memory works in practice, is that the decision about whether to catalog these materials retroactively was not made on the basis of their historical importance, but rather on the basis of whether integrating them into the public-facing catalog system would create ongoing administrative burdens or potential controversies. And the Vatican in the 1930s was dealing with significant diplomatic pressures related to its relationship with fascist Italy, with ongoing negotiations about church property and legal jurisdiction, and with internal debates about how much historical transparency was appropriate in an institution that understood itself as having a teaching mission that transcended historical scholarship. And in that context, the decision was made to maintain the existing status of materials in spaces like Riservato 14cc, to continue preserving them as part of the archive's physical holdings, but not to integrate them into the catalog systems that would make them accessible to researchers. This decision was not documented in any single dramatic decree. There's no papal bull declaring that certain materials must remain hidden, but rather emerged through a series of administrative memos, budget decisions about cataloging priorities, and unstated assumptions about which materials were appropriate for researcher access. And this kind of decision-making through administrative procedure rather than through explicit policy is characteristic of how institutions manage sensitive materials, creating layers of restriction that are procedural and structural rather than conspiratorial. Mercati's memorandum is significant for another reason. It reveals that by 1931, some Vatican archivists were themselves uncertain about what exactly was stored in chambers like Riservato 14cc, because the materials had been placed there during the Leo XIII reforms nearly 50 years earlier, and the archivists who had made those placement decisions were no longer alive, and the documentation that would have explained the logic behind those decisions was itself scattered across various administrative fondi that were not easily cross-referenceable. And so the Vatican found itself in a situation where it had physical spaces containing materials that were part of the archive, but about which the archive had incomplete knowledge, creating a kind of institutional amnesia where the Vatican knew that something was preserved in these spaces, but didn't necessarily have systematic records about what that something was. This is not a problem unique to the Vatican. It's a common challenge in large institutional archives that have undergone multiple reorganizations over centuries, where each reorganization creates new organizational logic that doesn't perfectly map onto the logic of previous systems. And over time, materials that fit awkwardly into the new systems end up in a kind of archival purgatory, where they are neither accessible nor entirely forgotten, but rather exist in a state of structured inaccessibility that persists through institutional inertia rather than through active concealment. You're now looking at the specific ways this system affected actual historical research, and to understand the practical consequences, you need to know about a particular case from 1967 involving a French historian named Jean de Lumeau, who was researching the history of confession practices in counter-Reformation Italy, and who had been granted access to certain fondi in the Vatican archives that contained records from Italian dioceses during the 16th and 17th centuries. And Delumeau's research methodology involved cross-referencing diocesan records with rota case files, because many confession-related controversies ended up in church court proceedings when local clergy disagreed about proper practice, or when penitents appealed decisions made by their confessors. And this methodology made sense because it would allow Delumeau to see not just the theoretical positions outlined in theological texts, but the actual application of confession practices in contested cases. But when Delumeau submitted formal requests to access specific categories of rota records that should have existed based on references in the diocesan materials he had already examined, he was told that no such records were available in the catalog system. And this response frustrated Delumeau because he could see clear references in the diocesan documents to cases that had been appealed to the rota, complete with case numbers and approximate dates. But when he tried to locate these cases through the Vatican's catalog system, they simply didn't appear. Delumeau's experience is documented in his own research notes, which are now preserved in the Archives Nationales in Paris under the classification code 517 AP, and in these notes he describes multiple instances where he found what he calls archival ghosts, references to documents that should exist based on the internal logic of the Church's own record-keeping, but that were not accessible through the standard catalog systems, and he speculates that these materials might be stored in spaces that were not integrated into the public-facing catalog, though he had no way to verify this speculation because the Vatican did not provide researchers with information about storage locations beyond what appeared in the official finding aids. The institutional mechanism that created this situation was not a simple matter of censorship or concealment, but rather involved the intersection of several archival practices that had evolved separately, but that together created significant access barriers, and the first of these practices was the distinction between materials that were catalogued by fondo and materials that were catalogued by collection, where fondo cataloging meant that materials were listed according to their institutional origin, and collection cataloging meant that materials had been grouped thematically by archivists at some point, and the rota materials that Delumeau needed fell into a complex category where they had originally been organized by fondo, but had then been partially reorganized during the 1880s reforms when certain categories of cases were designated as sensitive, and this partial reorganization meant that some rota materials appeared in the Scenario Garampi under their original fondo designation, while other materials had been moved to restricted storage spaces and were only listed in internal administrative registers that were not accessible to researchers. The second practice involved something called protective anonymization, which was a procedure developed during the 1920s whereby case files involving living individuals or their direct descendants were supposed to be stored separately from historical materials to protect privacy. But the definition of living individuals or direct descendants was applied inconsistently, and some archivists interpreted this broadly to mean any case where descendants might plausibly still exist, which in practice meant cases from as far back as the 16th century. And this broad interpretation meant that substantial categories of rota materials were classified as privacy protected, even though the individuals involved had been dead for 400 years. The verifiable historical anchor for understanding how this affected researchers comes from a reform initiative launched in 1976 by Pope Paul VI, who issued a directive calling for the Vatican archives to improve their access procedures and to create more transparent catalog systems. And this directive led to the establishment of a special commission that spent 3 years reviewing archival practices and produced a report in 1979 that identified numerous categories of materials that existed in archive storage but were not represented in researcher-accessible catalogs, and the report specifically mentions that certain storage chambers from the Leo XIII period contain materials that had never been integrated into modern catalog systems, and recommends that these materials be reviewed and cataloged appropriately. Though the report also notes that such cataloging would require substantial resources and would need to be balanced against other archival priorities. The Commission's report is preserved in the Vatican's administrative archives under the classification code arch.vat, indice 1171, fascicolo 4, and while the report doesn't name specific chambers, researchers who have examined it note that the descriptions of legacy reservation spaces match the architectural documentation of chambers like Riservato Fortuniosi, and the report's recommendations about cataloging materials from rota proceedings closely align with the categories that scholars like Delumeau had identified as being systematically inaccessible. The real consequence of this situation was that it created two different historical records of the Counter-Reformation period. One record based on materials that were accessible through normal archival research, which emphasized theological debates and institutional reforms, and another record that existed in inaccessible or partially accessible materials, which contained more detailed information about how theological positions were actually applied in contested cases, how church officials dealt with disagreements and exceptions, and how ordinary people experienced and sometimes resisted church practices, and historians working from accessible materials alone would produce narratives that, while not inaccurate, were necessarily incomplete because they couldn't account for the more complicated and sometimes contradictory evidence preserved in restricted materials. This is not a hypothetical concern. When materials from previously restricted portions of the Vatican archives have been opened during various reform periods, historians have regularly found that the newly accessible materials complicated or contradicted established narratives, not because the previous narratives were deliberately false, but because they were based on incomplete evidence. And this pattern suggests that materials still remaining in spaces like Riservato Antoine Fursi, if they were ever to be fully cataloged and made accessible, would likely produce similar complications to existing historical understandings. The system also created a specific problem for historians trying to assess the reliability of Vatican archival research more generally, because when historians publish work based on Vatican materials, readers and other scholars need to be able to trust that the historian has examined the relevant available evidence. But if substantial categories of relevant materials are not listed in accessible catalogs, then historians working in good faith might produce work that appears comprehensive based on catalog searches, but that is actually missing significant evidence, and there's no way for readers to know this unless they understand the structural features of the Vatican's catalog systems and the history of which materials have or haven't been integrated into those systems. Some historians have quietly argued that this situation requires a different standard of scholarly transparency, where historians working with Vatican materials should explicitly acknowledge not just which fondi they examined, but also which categories of potentially relevant materials they know exist but could not access. But this standard has been difficult to implement in practice because it requires historians to have detailed knowledge of Vatican archival organization and to be willing to highlight the limitations of their own research in ways that might seem to undermine their scholarly authority. And as a result, much published historical work based on Vatican materials presents itself as more comprehensive than it actually is. Not through deliberate deception, but through the normal conventions of historical scholarship that don't account for the specific structural features of how Vatican archives work. You're moving now into the question of what actually happened to the materials that were stored in Riservato Fursi, and this is where the documentary trail becomes more fragmentary, but also more revealing about how institutions manage sensitive materials over long time periods. And the key document here is a maintenance log from 1953, discovered by a Belgian researcher named Jan Hollebeek in 2004, while he was examining materials related to Vatican building renovations. And this log, which is preserved in the archive of the Fabbrica di San Pietro, the office responsible for maintaining Vatican buildings, records a series of structural inspections conducted in the subterranean archive spaces during the early 1950s. And one entry from April 1953 notes that during an inspection of the second basement level beneath the Cortile della Pigna, workers found signs of water damage in several storage chambers and recommended that materials stored in these spaces be relocated to better ventilated areas, and the entry lists several chamber designations, including one that reads Rismi Force Circe, which researchers interpret as an abbreviated form of Riservato 14-4C. The maintenance log doesn't specify what materials were stored in the chamber, but it does note that the relocation was completed in June 1953 and that the emptied chambers were subsequently used for non-archival storage, which typically meant they were converted to holding spaces for maintenance equipment or building supplies. And this notation suggests that whatever materials had been stored in Riservato 14C for approximately 70 years were moved to a different location during this renovation period. But the log doesn't indicate where they were moved to, and there's no corresponding entry in the Vatican's archival catalogs documenting this relocation, which means that the materials effectively disappeared from the documentary record at this point, or at least became even more difficult to trace than they had been when they were in their original location. The institutional mechanism at work in this relocation is something archivists call administrative displacement, which occurs when materials are moved for legitimate operational reasons, in this case, building maintenance and preservation concerns. But the movement is not documented in the systems that track archival holdings, because the people making the movement decisions are facilities staff rather than archival staff. And facilities staff are focused on the physical logistics of moving materials safely rather than on maintaining the intellectual organization systems that allow researchers to locate materials. And this disconnect between physical management and intellectual control is a persistent challenge in large archives where different departments handle different aspects of archive operation. In the Vatican's case, the disconnect was particularly significant during the 1950s because the archive was undergoing substantial changes following World War II, with increased pressure from scholars for better access, growing concern about proper preservation methods as archival science was developing new standards for temperature and humidity control, and ongoing debates within the Church about how much historical transparency was appropriate in the post-war period when the Church's relationship with fascism was coming under increased scrutiny. And in this context, decisions about where to relocate materials from water-damaged chambers were being made by people who had multiple competing priorities and who may not have fully understood the significance of maintaining documentation about where specific materials were stored. The verifiable historical anchor that helps us understand what might have happened to these materials comes from a separate set of documents related to the construction of new archive storage facilities during the 1960s, when Pope Paul VI authorized a major expansion of the Vatican archives to accommodate growing collections and to implement better preservation standards. And these construction documents, which are preserved in the Archivio Storico della Fabbrica di San Pietro under the classification code ARM 34, P11-2, include inventories of materials that were moved into the new storage facilities between 1965 and 1970. And these inventories are organized by the rooms or areas from which materials were being relocated. And several entries refer to materials being moved from temporary storage in various locations around the Vatican. And some researchers have suggested that materials from Riservato C might have been included in these relocations, particularly materials that would have been part of the 1953 relocation from the water-damaged chambers. But the inventories don't use the original chamber designations. They instead use generic descriptions like legal proceedings materials or mixed jurisdiction cases, which makes it impossible to trace specific collections back to their original storage locations with certainty. The real consequence of this series of relocations is the materials, which were already difficult to access because they weren't properly cataloged, became even more difficult to access because their physical location was no longer documented, even in the limited administrative records that had previously existed. And this creates a situation where materials effectively exist in a state of institutional limbo. They are presumably still somewhere in the Vatican archives. They were moved and relocated according to proper preservation procedures. But there's no longer a clear trail that would allow either archivists or researchers to say with confidence, these specific materials are now stored in this specific location. And this kind of limbo is surprisingly common in large institutional archives that have undergone multiple reorganizations, where the logic of each reorganization makes sense in its own moment, but where the cumulative effect of multiple reorganizations is to create layers of displacement that become increasingly difficult to untangle over time. Some historians have argued that this displacement is effectively a form of permanent inaccessibility, that materials which have been through multiple undocumented relocations are so thoroughly lost within the archive's own systems that even if there were no official restrictions on access, the practical challenge of locating them would be nearly insurmountable. And in this sense, the question of whether materials are officially restricted becomes almost beside the point when the materials can't be located even by archivists who might want to make them accessible. The situation is complicated further by changes in how the Vatican archives have been managed over the past several decades, particularly the increasing digitization of catalog systems and finding aids, because digitization creates pressure to integrate materials into standardized catalog entries, but it also creates challenges for materials that don't fit neatly into existing catalog categories or that have complex provenance histories, and archivists working on digitization projects have to make decisions about whether to spend time and resources trying to trace the history of materials with unclear provenance, or whether to focus on materials that are already well documented and can be integrated into digital systems more easily. And the practical reality is that materials like those that were originally stored in Riservato 14 tend to fall into the category of complex provenance cases that get deferred in favor of more straightforward cataloging work, which means that even as the Vatican archives become more accessible overall through digitization, certain categories of materials may actually become less likely to be cataloged because the resources required to sort out their complicated histories don't align with the efficiency pressures of digital cataloging projects. This is not unique to the Vatican. It's a pattern visible in archives around the world where digitization paradoxically creates new forms of inaccessibility for materials that don't fit the standardized formats that digital systems require. And the result is a growing divide between materials that are highly accessible through digital catalogs and materials that exist in a kind of pre-digital twilight, where they are preserved but increasingly difficult to access through any of the systems that contemporary researchers use. Now, you're examining what researchers have been able to piece together about the contents of Riservato 14 through indirect evidence, through references in other documents, through the kind of archival detective work that involves tracing citations and cross-references across multiple fondi to reconstruct what materials might have existed in spaces that are no longer accessible or documentable. And the most systematic attempt to do this was undertaken by an Italian historian named Gigliola Fragnito in the early 2000s while she was researching church censorship practices during the Counter-Reformation, and Fragnito's methodology involved creating a database of every reference she could find in accessible Vatican materials to documents or proceedings that should exist based on the internal logic of church record-keeping, but that didn't appear in archive catalogs. And she then tried to identify patterns in these missing materials to understand whether they shared common characteristics that might explain why they had been excluded from catalog systems. Fragnito's research, which was published in several articles between 2005 and 2010, and later synthesized in her book La Bibbia al Rogo, which focused on prohibited books but included substantial material on broader censorship mechanisms, identified approximately 230 specific case references that appeared to be systematically inaccessible. And when she analyzed the characteristics of these cases, she found that they clustered around several categories: cases involving challenges to church teaching from within the clergy itself, cases that documented conflicts between different religious orders, cases related to the Inquisition's proceedings against people who had powerful political connections, and cases involving property disputes where church claims intersected with civil law in ways that raised questions about the extent of church jurisdiction. And these categories align closely with the kinds of materials that Hubert Jedden had suggested might be stored in spaces like Riservato 14 based on his analysis of that 1879 blueprint and its relationship to Rota records. The institutional mechanism that created this pattern of inaccessibility was not a single decision to hide controversial materials, but rather a series of classificatory choices made during different reform periods, where materials that fit into sensitive categories were given restricted designations, and then when archives were reorganized, these restricted designations were interpreted as indicators that materials should not be integrated into new catalog systems, and over time, The cumulative effect of these decisions was to create categories of materials that were systematically excluded from researcher access, not because anyone made a single decision to exclude them, but because a series of smaller administrative decisions had that cumulative effect, and this is characteristic of how institutional memory works in practice. Rarely through dramatic acts of suppression, more often through the gradual accumulation of small bureaucratic choices that add up to substantial patterns of inaccessibility. The Vatican's case is particularly interesting because the Church has, especially since the Second Vatican Council, repeatedly expressed commitment to historical transparency and has opened substantial portions of the archives to researchers, including materials that some Church officials initially resisted opening. And yet these openings haven't fully addressed the structural issues that create pockets of inaccessibility, partly because resolving those issues would require resources and institutional attention that compete with other priorities, and partly because the people making decisions about archive access may not fully understand the historical accumulation of administrative practices that created the current situation. The verifiable historical anchor for understanding how these patterns affect contemporary research comes from the most recent major archive opening, which occurred in March 2020, when Pope Francis authorized the opening of materials from the pontificate of Pius X, who served from 1939 to 1958, and this opening was highly anticipated by historians because Pius X's papacy coincided with World War II and the Holocaust, and there had been ongoing debates about what the Church knew about Nazi actions and how Church officials responded. And when the materials were opened, researchers found substantial documentation, including diplomatic correspondence, internal Vatican discussions, and reports from various sources about conditions in occupied territories. But researchers also found that certain categories of materials that should exist based on references in the opened documents were still not accessible, and some historians suggested that these gaps might indicate that materials were in storage locations that hadn't been included in the catalog work done in preparation for the opening, possibly because they were in spaces that had been designated as restricted during earlier periods and that hadn't been systematically reviewed as part of the Pius X opening process. This isn't to suggest deliberate concealment, but rather indicates the persistent challenge of navigating materials that have complex archival histories and that may be stored in locations that don't align neatly with the organizational logic of the current catalog systems. The real consequence of this situation for historical understanding is that we have a growing body of Vatican-based research that is sophisticated and valuable, but that is also necessarily incomplete in ways that are difficult to quantify because we don't have full documentation of what remains inaccessible. And this creates particular challenges for topics where church positions or actions have been controversial, because critics can always suggest that inaccessible materials might contain evidence that would change our understanding, while defenders can point to the substantial materials that have been opened and that provide a particular picture of events, and both positions are reasonable given the limitations of available evidence, but neither can be definitively proven without access to materials that may exist in spaces like riservato fortissimo cc, or in the locations where materials from such spaces were relocated. And this creates a kind of permanent uncertainty where historical debates can't be fully resolved, not because of bad faith on any side, but because of structural features of how archives work. And some historians have argued that this situation actually serves institutional interests even without deliberate suppression, because uncertainty allows institutions to benefit from both transparency by pointing to materials that have been opened and from restriction by maintaining that closed materials would support institutional positions if they were accessible. And whether this dynamic is intentional or simply an emergent property of how large archives function is itself a question that can't be definitively answered without better understanding of decision-making processes that are themselves often not fully documented. The pattern also raises questions about what responsibility institutions have to actively investigate and resolve gaps in their own archival systems. rather than simply maintaining existing structures. And some archivists have argued that major institutions like the Vatican have an ethical obligation to undertake systematic projects to identify materials that are preservation present but navigation absent, and to make those materials accessible if there are no compelling contemporary reasons to restrict them. But such projects would require substantial resources and would necessarily involve making judgments about which materials are genuinely sensitive and which have simply accumulated restrictions through historical accident. And making those judgments is complicated because it requires balancing respect for privacy, concern for institutional reputation, commitment to historical truth, and practical constraints on resources and staff time. And different people within any institution will have different priorities about how to balance these concerns. And the result is often a kind of institutional paralysis where everyone agrees that better access would be valuable, but no one can agree on how to prioritize the work of improving access against other institutional needs. And materials remain in their ambiguous state, not because anyone actively wants them to be inaccessible, but because the work of making them accessible is difficult and resource-intensive and requires institutional will that may not exist, even among people who are genuinely committed to transparency in principle. You've reached the point now where the story of Riservato 14C becomes less about a specific chamber and more about what that chamber represents, in terms of how institutional memory works, how decisions made decades or centuries ago continue to shape what we can and cannot know about the past, and how the structural features of archives create forms of silence that are neither conspiracy nor accident, but something more complex. And if you're still listening at this point, 2 hours into this story, then you understand that what matters here is not whether there's some dramatic secret hidden in that chamber, but rather how the existence of spaces like that chamber reveals the mechanisms through which institutions manage knowledge. And those mechanisms are not simple. They involve layers of legitimate concerns about privacy and institutional functioning, layers of historical accident and administrative convenience, layers of resource constraints and competing priorities, and layers of institutional inertia where practices persist, not because anyone actively chooses them, but because changing them would require effort and attention that institutions don't have or don't prioritize. The chamber that appears only in one blueprint is interesting not because it's exceptional, but because it's a visible example of a pattern that likely exists in many forms throughout institutional archives, where materials are preserved but not accessible, where knowledge is held but not shared, where the past exists in institutional memory but not in forms that allow for collective historical understanding. And understanding this pattern matters because it shapes what we think we know about institutions, about history, about how decisions were made and why. And it reminds us that historical knowledge is always partial, always shaped by what has been preserved and what has been made accessible and what has been cataloged in ways that allow researchers to find it. The final piece of evidence worth considering comes from a conversation that took place in 2018 at a conference on archival ethics held in Rome, where several archivists from various institutions, including the Vatican, were discussing challenges in managing historical materials. And one Vatican archivist, speaking under the assumption that the conversation was private, though it was later summarized in conference notes taken by a participant, acknowledged that the Vatican archives contain categories of materials that exist in what she called structural inaccessibility, where the materials are physically present and preserved, but where accessing them would require archival work that hasn't been done, such as creating catalog entries, determining appropriate access restrictions, or even just physically locating materials whose storage locations were not properly documented during past reorganizations. And she estimated, though she emphasized this was speculation based on her experience rather than any systematic inventory, that such materials might constitute somewhere between 5 and 15% of the Vatican's total holdings, which would be a substantial amount given that the Vatican archives contain an estimated 85 linear kilometers of shelving. And she noted that addressing this situation would require resources and institutional commitment that didn't currently exist, not because church officials opposed transparency, but because the practical work of making materials accessible competed with other archival priorities, and because the potential controversy of opening certain materials created disincentives for archivists to prioritize that work. This conversation matters not because it reveals any specific secret, but because it confirms what careful analysis of Vatican archival practices suggests, that there are substantial categories of materials that exist in states of inaccessibility that have more to do with archival infrastructure and institutional priorities than with active suppression, and that resolving these situations would require not just changes in access policies, but changes in how institutions allocate resources to archival work, and how they balance the value of historical access against other institutional concerns. The question of what was actually in Riservato 14th may never be definitively answered, and in some ways that's the point. The significance of that chamber is not primarily about its specific contents, but about what it reveals about how institutions manage knowledge over time, how administrative decisions accumulate to create patterns of access and restriction, and how materials can become effectively inaccessible not through anyone's deliberate choice, but through the accumulated weight of bureaucratic practices that each make sense in their own moment, but that collectively create substantial gaps in what can be known. And this pattern is not unique to the Vatican. It's visible in government archives, corporate records, university collections, anywhere that institutions preserve their own history and make decisions about what to make accessible and when. And understanding this pattern matters because it shapes how we think about historical evidence, about institutional accountability, about the relationship between transparency and trust. The chamber that appears only in one blueprint is a reminder that silence in archives is not always the result of conscious suppression, that gaps in historical knowledge often have mundane explanations, rooted in resource constraints and administrative complexity, and that making sense of institutional history requires understanding not just what institutions say about themselves, but how the systems they use to preserve and provide access to their records shape what can be known about their past. And this kind of understanding requires patience with complexity, comfort with ambiguity, and recognition that historical truth is always partial and always shaped by the structures through which we try to access it. So here you are at the end, 2 hours later, and maybe you're lying in the dark listening to this. Maybe you're driving through the night. Maybe you're working through an insomniac hour, and what you've heard is not a mystery story with a revelation at the end, but rather an examination of how institutions work, how memory functions, how the past becomes accessible or remains hidden through mechanisms that are structural rather than conspiratorial. And if that's satisfying to you, if that's the kind of understanding you were looking for when you started listening, then this story has done what it was meant to do, which is not to provide easy answers, but to help you think more carefully about how knowledge works, how institutions function, and how the historical record is always incomplete in ways that matter. Before you go, if this story gave you something worth your time, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video. It helps other people find these stories. And if you want more of this kind of careful examination of how institutions, history, and archives work, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe to Tales of Vatican Secrets, because I share new stories like this every day, each one looking at a different aspect of how institutional memory works and what we can understand about the past through the documents and structures that have been preserved. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, for staying with something that asked for patience and attention, and I hope you find whatever you're looking for in the hours ahead.